Okay, that should start it. Good afternoon, and welcome to this edition of the Herman P. and Sophia Taubman Endowed Symposium in Jewish Studies. My name is Lee Rothfarb, Program Director, and with us today is the former Program Director for many, many years, almost 3 decades, Richard Hecht. Our Program Assistant, Noah Weiss, is not able to be here today, otherwise he would be visible as well. Today, our guest is Professor Omer Bartov. It's been advertised ahead of time. We all know what this is going to be about. Given Professor Bartov's career, I could spend as much time introducing him as it will take him to do his presentation, or I could say near nothing because his renown precedes him. I'll come in somewhere in between those two and just give a thumbnail sketch of his background and accomplishments, and then we will launch into his presentation today. Professor Bartov took his PhD in history at St. Anthony's College at Oxford University and is currently professor of history at Brown University, where he holds the Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies since 2022. Recent major appointments in the past include J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Senior Scholar in Residence at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, also a fellow of the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, visiting scholar at the Center for Polish Studies at Tel Aviv University and the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and distinguished visiting professor going back to 2011 in the Department of History at National Taiwan University. Other earlier honorific appointments include ones at Princeton, Harvard, Tel Aviv, Freiburg, and Paris. It's truly international. To address the publications, staggeringly prolific. More than 20 books, several of them translated into many languages, 3 novels, one of them, The Butterfly and the Axe, which is going to be the subject of today's talk, which we'll get to soon. 80 chapters, more than 100 articles in journals, better than 300 scholarly presentations around the globe, extensive and distinguished service to the profession, more than 40 scholarly awards and grants. In brief overview, in the research, early research concerned Nazi indoctrination of the Wehrmacht and the crimes committed in World War II. He then turned his attention to links between total war and genocide, and his recent work has focused on interethnic relations in the borderlands of Eastern Europe. A publication there of note is his book, Tales from the Borderlands, Making and Unmaking the Galician Past. I've mentioned The Butterfly and the Axe, which is a novel published in January of 23, so not that long ago. His new book, which has just come out with Bloomsbury, Genocide, the Holocaust, and Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis, just appeared, I think. Yes?
Yeah, in August.
Yeah, just appeared in August. So in any given year, we would have to update this by several pages. So prolific is Professor Bartov. But today, we're having a different kind of presentation, not a scholarly one, a very, very personal one about his own family in a history that is somewhere between, how should we say, fact and fiction. Somehow it's very imaginative since it's based on a single conversation with his mother about the background. But having gleaned from that and done extensive research over the years before, including for Butterfly and the Axe, we have this novel. So we're very excited to be able to hear firsthand from the author about it, its background, and I know he's going to read from it extensively. I know that you'll enjoy this. It's beautifully written. So please, Dr. Bartov.
Thank you so much, Lee, and thank you, Richard, and thank you to all those who are listening now or may listen to the recording. As Lee said, what I will try to do today is to introduce to you a novel that I wrote that came out in January last year. It came out in English, and then it came out also in Hebrew. I wrote it in both languages. English was obviously the one language that nobody spoke in the area in which the novel takes place. People spoke many languages there, but English was not one of them. They spoke Russian and Ukrainian and Polish and Yiddish and German and Hebrew, but not English. So writing it in English was a very interesting experience for me. It's the first novel I've written in English. I wrote two in the 1980s in Hebrew before coming to this country. Instead of introducing the novel as I speak now, what I will do at the moment is share my screen with you. And hopefully you can all see my screen. And I will read you a little bit from the introduction to the novel that will give you some idea of what it is about or what I have tried to do in it as a historian writing fiction and why I chose to do that. And following that, I'll read some excerpts, short excerpts from the novel. And hopefully that will open up also a discussion. So I will start reading right now. I began thinking about the story some 3 decades ago when my mother told me about the death of her great-grandfather in Galicia on the eve of World War II. At the age of 97, or 103, depending on the version of the story, he waited for the members of the family to arrive from near and far to bid farewell before he died. Most of those who came were murdered shortly thereafter in the Holocaust, but no one ever found out the exact circumstances of their deaths. Years later, when I was writing Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buchach, which is a scholarly book that came out in 2018, I was struck by the fact that while I had spent 20 years researching this town, I ultimately had found nothing about how my own family members living there were murdered. I had recreated the life and death of a town, going through thousands of documents and hundreds of testimonies. But my family had been eradicated and erased from the historical record, and there was nothing I could do about that. Yet I felt that I needed to do something in a different way, not as a historian. Through my imagination, I needed to provide them with a credible life story within the contours of history. Over the years, I also became increasingly aware that even if I, like so many others across several generations, did not know how my own family had been murdered, that unrecorded event had nevertheless traveled from one generation to another, an unspoken, inexpressible trauma that altered and damaged our psyches. It appeared to me that not only was it necessary to give justice to those who had been killed by imagining their lives and deaths, rather than simply noting that they had occurred, but also that the long-term ramifications of this violence, the trauma that seeped from one generation to another, could only be mitigated by returning to the scene of the crime. So this book is an attempt to do so. It is therefore neither a work of fiction nor of history, neither a biography nor a conventional novel. It is an attempt to fill in the gaps that the historical record has left us to grapple with in ways that respect and conform to information we have, yet transgress the limits of scholarship. It does so by presenting a series of characters who never existed, but could have, by linking actual historical figures to imaginary ones, and by reconstructing the lives and deaths of actual people in a manner that cannot be supported by documents, but emanates from the little that we do know about them from fragments of stories, rumors, and memories. Because we can never return to the past, and because the past is always experienced and remembered differently by those who populated it, this book tells its story through the perspective of real and imaginary characters. As a result, when we eventually discover what actually happened, we are left to speculate whether it is the whole truth. The historical truth necessarily lies somewhere in between, never quite resolved and always disputed. In this journey into the past, we learn how one violent event, the murder of a family in a remote Ukrainian village in the spring of 1944, determined the fate of two families, one Ukrainian and one Jewish, in ways that could not easily be understood by later generations. At the same time, we see how this painful journey into the past, the obsession with finding out what happened, can bring about a modicum of peace and reconciliation. Thus, we can take the bitter fruits of that violence and make understanding possible where previously there was denial, and replace hatred with love. Straddling history and fiction, this book acknowledges that historical study, as we know it, cannot do sufficient justice to those who vanished without a trace. They need to be brought back so as to make history whole. Still, every letter, diary, and testimony reproduced within these pages closely follows a historical source. In that sense, the reader is left wondering, what is real and what is fiction? By breaking down the walls of the past, readers can enter a world that was once as real as our own, though it has now largely disappeared from memory and history. For me, as an author, as a historian, it is important to keep the ambivalence created by the impossibility of distinguishing between what is fact and what is fiction. What I've written is meant to challenge both genres, but also my readers. Even if the past can only be reconstructed by imaginary characters within a historical framework, it does not mean that the narrative of this retelling is less true than an erratic documentary record that gives no voice to many of the victims of this era. There is no single historical truth, after all. So that is my introduction. And as you can imagine, being a historian, I am in a sense torn, because as a historian, I could not tell the story because I don't have the documents. And yet, in fictionalizing that story, I tried to remain as close as I could to what it would have been had I had these documents, which in this book, I actually had to invent. So I will write you, I will read now the first extract. This extract comes from a letter by the narrator's mother. So there is a narrator in this novel, and he finds an old letter that his mother sent him. And in that letter, she describes a visit by her aunt, called Tova, from Palestine to their hometown in Galicia, Poland, in 1939. And during that visit, she met her husband's sister, Rochale, known, her nickname was the Jewel in the Crown, because she had married a man called Max, who had an academic degree, not a common feature at the time. During the trip, they go together to the village where they had grown up and where their grandfather had long served as the estate manager. And I start the reading now. What became of Max and Rochale in the last years before the war I know from Tova. I distinctly recall her telling me that she and Rochale had so much in common, though Tova was 24 and Rochale almost 30. Both of them had little girls. Hanale was 4, and Rochale's Judith was just a year older. And both were married to men who did not quite accomplish what they had set out to do, and were made unhappy, not only by their own failures, but also by their wives' disappointment in them. So here were these two women asking themselves where they had gone wrong, and if they could still repair the damage, one by leaving, and the other by returning. The highlight of Tova's visit was the trip they all made together to the family's old village of Miezhin on the banks of the Dniester, or was it the Dnieper? Tova said they were so happy and carefree there, just like little children, with all their lives still ahead of them, running through the forest, watching the logs float down the river, playing with the girls on the beach. They would sit by the fireplace late into the night and dream about their futures as if nothing stood between them and their desires but the darkness of the night that would soon lift with a glorious sunrise over the vast expanse of trees and water. They wandered through the old house where the new estate manager, a young, energetic man, keen to modernize the estate, hosted them. He found the old Grafina, that's the Duchess, who owned the estate, to be too set in her ways, especially since the passing of her sister, but got on well with the two sons. Unfortunately, they were mostly away in Lviv and Warsaw, and had little interest in farming. This Dmitro and his wife Oksana had been great hosts and served them delicious dairy kasha. Our region was famous for its groats, from which kasha is made. Oksana was expecting and already a little heavy. She was a young woman with delicate features and a beautiful, thick, blonde braid. Tova and the rest of the family were not very interested in Dmitro's agricultural plans, least of all Max, who had reluctantly agreed to come with them, but kept seeking opportunities to withdraw somewhere and stick his nose into his book. But they listened, because they did not want to offend Dmitro, possibly the first Ukrainian to ever manage that old Polish estate. He was so proud to have bought off the Schumers, whose name had been linked to the estate for as long as anyone in the village could remember. Dmitro was actually a Hutzul, one of those people who lived mostly in the mountains, and he told them that up there in the Carpathians, there were very different Jews. Muscle Jews, he called them, who worked as loggers and carpenters and blacksmiths and were just like their neighbors, only that they prayed to the Jewish God. Where he came from, he said, everyone was as poor as the next person, but all were free and independent. Tova told me that above the fireplace, close to the table where we had celebrated many Shabbat dinners and Passover seders, Dmitro had hung one of the only items he had brought with him from the mountains, a large axe with a broad hand-forged blade. It had a beautifully carved long wooden handle and had been in his family for generations. It was a symbol of the tough and proud Hutzul mountain-dwelling nation, where every man had his own bartka, as he'd called it, a tool that serves every purpose. It could be a walking stick and a hammer, or be used for cutting down trees or fending off wild beasts and robbers. He took the bartka off the wall and let the guests touch it. In the afternoon, one of the stable boys, Michailo, a nice but taciturn lad, wearing clothes so tattered that they seemed to be made from discarded rags and walking barefoot, took them across the meadow toward the Grafina's house. They met her two sons, Władek and Yannick, who were there with their families over the summer. They were tall, elegantly dressed middle-aged men, very different from Tova and Rochale's husbands, the doting old revolutionary and the downcast scholar. They reminisced about the days when they were boys on the estate, playing soccer on the village green with the two Schumer boys. Leaning on their walking canes and smoking long pipes, Władek and Yannick asked how Yaakov and Adolf were doing in Palestine. They did well to leave, they said. This place is going to the dogs. Behind them, the mansion was visibly falling apart, with its plaster peeling and some of the window panes missing. The garden was covered with weeds, and the general impression was that of a charming Italian ruin you see in travel books, not a dwelling for aristocrats. There were butterflies everywhere, of all colors and shapes, flying up and down in unison like a vast multicolored blanket as the little girls chased them across the meadow. They had quickly become firm friends and were utterly happy together. Hanale was heartbroken when they eventually had to board the train for the long journey back, passing through endless fields heavy with grain and vast forests stretching as far as the eye could see. From the train window, they waved to village girls leading cows to pasture. The geese were running alongside the railroad tracks, and Hanale cried and cried, as if they would never see them again. They never did. So this is the first section from the novel, and I'll move to the next one. And in this section, Tali, who is a young Israeli woman and Tova's granddaughter, tells the narrator about her visit in 2003 to the family's village of Miezhin, that same village that we heard about now, together with Andriy, who is a British man of Ukrainian origins. And she tells of what they discovered when they came there. Less than a mile from the bridge, we turned right onto a dirt road and spent the next hours bumping along it, driving in and out of patches of forest and farmland, with fleeting glimpses of the Dniester to our right. Finally, a rusty metal sign indicated that we had arrived. Throughout the drive, we had hardly exchanged a word. Andriy drove slowly into the village, a single street of small houses on either side with fields stretching out behind them. Andriy rolled down his window and spoke with an old man walking down the street. The man became quite animated. Then he got into the back seat and began giving Andriy directions. Our path took us toward a patch of forest separating the village from the river. In front of us were the ruins of a mansion surrounded by tall trees. The roof had caved in, and the vegetation had taken over the interior. Our friend Mikola tells me that this is where the Polish estate owner and her sons lived when he was a boy, said Andriy. My grandfather worked here as a stable boy. He stopped the car and we got out. There was a wonderful smell in the air of pine, soil, and food being cooked. Across the dirt road from the mansion were a few low houses. This must have been the estate manager's house, Andriy said when we reached the spot. The houses were all abandoned. Why is no one living here? I asked. The old man had stayed behind by the car, and I could now hear him calling out to us. I turned back and saw him pointing at one of the houses and gesturing, passing a finger over his throat, and I could not quite tell whether he was grinning or expressing horror. What is he saying? I asked Andriy. He says that there was a murder here, and people are afraid to come to this spot. They say it brings bad luck. Who was murdered? When did it happen? Mikola lit a cigarette, coughed, and spat on the ground. Ask him, I insisted. We should go back to the village, Andrei said. I don't think he likes being here. Let me just walk around a bit. This is where my family came from, I said. Andrei looked surprised. I thought they came from Porushenia. My grandfather, Adolf, was born and grew up right here on the estate, as apparently did yours. It had become warmer, and one could almost sense that spring was around the corner. We walked over to the larger house in the yard, which seemed to have withstood the ravages of time better than the mansion. I tried the door. It was unlocked, and we walked slowly into the dark interior of an almost empty room. They were afraid of ghosts, said Andrei, but they took all the furniture. There was a large fireplace at one end. Above it hung a large axe with a beautifully decorated handle. That's weird, Andrei said. You would have thought that the peasants wouldn't have left this behind. I don't like this place, I said. It feels creepy. Let's get out. There was a gust of wind, and the door slammed shut. All I could see was the blade of the axe shining on the wall. I held Andrei's arm. Let's go, I insisted. We made our way back to the car, where Mikola was patiently waiting, smoking a cigarette. Hey, look, I called out. A beautiful large butterfly was hovering over the bushes by the car. A harbinger of spring, Andrei answered. We drove back to the village, where Mikola insisted that we join him for a glass of vodka. We sat in the tiny enclosed porch of his house, which seemed to have only one room. He was a wiry man with a deeply creased face and bright blue eyes. He smelt of sweat, alcohol, and tobacco. His wife, a large woman, brought out a tray with vodka and glasses, a loaf of bread, and a jar of honey. The sun streamed in through a filter of finely woven curtains, casting geometrical shapes on the table. Outside, chickens pecked in the yard. We raised our glasses. I told them that your family once lived here, said Andrei. They're very happy that you've come to visit. I thanked them and asked if they remember my family. No, Andrei said. They were little children during the war. People in the village say that the Polish owners always had a Jew to manage their estate. But just before the war, the Jews left, and the estate was managed by someone from the Carpathians, a Hutzul. Do they know what happened here? Mikola poured another round, but Andrei refused. I told him that I have a long drive ahead, he said. Mikola lit a cigarette and talked for a while. I did not want to interrupt him and waited until he finished. As we left the house, we saw that neighbors had gathered on the street, eager to watch these unlikely visitors. We got into the car and drove off, taking with us Mikola's lingering odor. What did he tell you? As we bumped along the dirt road, I felt lightheaded from the 2 shots of vodka. Mikola told me that when the Germans came, the estate manager was a Hutzul, whose name may have been Dmitro. The Polish owner, the Grafina, had died, and her sons had been deported by the Soviets. So Dmitro managed the estate, convinced that the sons would eventually come back to reclaim their property. But people in the village thought that this was just an excuse to take over the Poles' property. Dmitro had twins, 2 babies born just when the war began. The Soviets didn't mind him taking care of the farm, but for a while some of their men stayed in the mansion and messed it up. A bit later, when the Soviets fled from the Germans, they took with them most of the furniture and any valuables they could lay their hands on. No self-respecting German would have wanted to stay in this ransacked hole in the wall, so they left Dmitro and the village in peace. The villagers were jealous of this Hutu, because he had so much land and livestock and could do whatever he wanted now that his masters were gone. He never moved into the big house. A few months before the Soviets returned, a rumor started going around the village that Mitro was hiding Jews on the estate. By then, there had already been many killings of Jews in the area, but Meren, which is the Ukrainian name for Mezhin, hadn't had any Jews since your great-grandfather sold his house to Dmitro. People heard about Jews being killed in nearby towns, but that had not affected their own lives, apart from the fact that since the Germans arrived, there were no Jews to buy their produce. Instead, they had to bring it to the market themselves, and market days in towns such as Poroshenia were very different after the Germans came. In any case, it was after most of the nearby Jews had been killed that those rumors began circulating about Dmitro hiding Jews. People said, "This cunning Hutzul, not only has he taken over the Polish estate, now he's making a fortune from the Jews he's hiding. He gets rich while we are getting poor." Other people worried that Dmitro's actions would put the whole village in jeopardy, and that all the houses would be burned down if the Germans or the Ukrainian police found out. But no one denounced him. In the end, Dmitro himself was at the root of what happened. In spring 1944, Andrei continued, when the Germans began their retreat from the area, the Wehrmacht took up positions in many remote villages, and one company, Mikola was sure it was a Waffen-SS unit, established itself in the village. The company commander and his staff set themselves up in the old mansion. This was very dangerous. By now, everyone knew that Mitro was hiding a Jewish family under the Germans' noses, because just weeks before the SS arrived in the village, the Jewish family had been blessed with a baby. And the farm laborers who lived nearby could hear the cries of the woman who delivered it. They soon established that this family was made up of a young couple, a little girl and a baby, who was delivered in Dmitro's house with the help of his wife. No one knows exactly what happened, but when the SS company relocated, the Hutzul and his family disappeared, and no trace was found of the Jewish family Dmitro had allegedly hidden in the barn. And since the Germans had burned down the barn as part of their scorched earth policy, it was impossible to confirm whether there had in fact been any Jews there in the first place. Some people thought it was just a malicious rumor, as no one had ever seen them. But then, why did the Hutzul take his family and flee, leaving behind all their property? Was he afraid of Jewish revenge now that the communists were returning? So now I move to the third excerpt. And this excerpt is actually excerpts from Mikhailo's confession. So Mikhailo, the lad we met in 1939, is Andrei's grandfather. And before he dies, he writes a confession, which is given to Andrei after his death. So he finds that confession in 2016. And in that text that Mikhailo left his grandson Andrei, he tells him about the murder of Rochale, Max, and their children in the spring of 1944. Gradually, the darkness lifted, and I could see that the Germans were ready to go. The commander came out of the villa and got into the car. He drove toward the village, where the rest of the unit was billeted, followed by the big truck. For a moment, the sound of their engines filled the air. Then it grew still again. I looked around the yard. It was a beautiful spring morning, and birdsong filled the air. It was still very cold, though. A large butterfly was hovering close to the ground, and then perhaps carried by a light breeze, glided almost to the top of the barn. At that moment, I distinctly heard the cry of a baby, rapidly smothered. It almost certainly came from inside the barn. They're in the hayloft, I thought. Go up there and take care of them. I heard Stepan's baritone behind me. I turned around, and there they were, the whole group, armed to the teeth. I jumped to my feet. Can you handle this pistol? Stepan handed me a German Luger. We'll make sure the Hutzul doesn't get in the way. Do you want me to kill them? I asked, trying to sound as calm as I could. Of course. Why do you think we're here? Do you want to be a fighter or a stable boy? I've never fired a weapon in my life, I answered, handing back the pistol. Then I heard the door of the estate manager's house open and saw Dmitro stepping out. He was holding his axe. What are you doing on my property? He called out. You'd better leave right now. And let go of that boy, too, he added, when he saw me behind Stepan's back. You're hiding Jews here, Stepan said calmly. How dare you accuse me of that? Dmitro responded. Do you think I'd hide Jews when the Germans are everywhere? Well, said Stepan, now the Germans are gone, so you should have no worries about letting them go. I will do as I please on my property, Dmitro answered, and started walking toward us, the wide blade of his axe glittering in the early morning sun. I know who you are, he said to Stepan as he came closer. You are that no-good bastard who squealed on your own people to the Bolsheviks, and now you're playing at being a hero again. 2 shots rang out, and Dmitro fell lifelessly on the ground, still holding his axe. You should really learn how to use a Luger, Stepan said, observing his pistol. The Germans make damn good weapons. But since you can't use firearms, you'd better take that axe. I'm sure you know how to handle that. I walked over to Dmitro's slumped body. His head was a bloody mess. You could not see his face. In the distance, I could hear someone shrieking. It must be Oksana, I thought. I felt nothing, as if my insides had frozen. The other guys were joking around, making fun of that stupid peasant and his axe. He was holding on to it so tightly that I had difficulty extracting it from his hand. Finally, I stood up, holding the axe in both hands. It was a beautiful tool, with a large, broad blade and an intricately carved wooden handle, now spattered with Dmitro's blood. Oksana was screaming my name in the distance. Go over there and shut that woman up, Stepan said to one of his men. Now get on with it. We don't have all day, he said, turning to me. He was still holding the Luger, tilting it this way and that, as if to see whether it was well balanced. I walked over to the barn door and pulled out the wooden bar. A couple of shots rang out behind me, and Oksana's screams now turned into something I had never heard before, like screams from a wild beast whose limbs were being torn apart. You can go and play too, boys, Stepan said to the other men. I'll keep watch over the stable boy. I walked into the dark barn. It was cooler inside and smelt of manure and fresh hay. I let my eyes get used to the darkness and saw a ladder at the far end, its top part leaning onto the hayloft. I slowly approached it. Just before I reached it, someone leaped at me from behind a bundle of hay. I swung at him with the axe and heard a dull sound as the blade hit his head. He died without a whimper. It was a middle-aged man, quite thin. He had no shoes on and smelt of urine, excrement, and sweat. I had literally split his head in half. In the light increasingly streaming into the barn from the narrow openings at the top, I could see a pair of round glasses on the floor a few feet away from him. I stuck the handle of the axe into my belt and climbed slowly up the ladder. So now I'll read you one other short extract. This extract comes from the diary of Judith. Judith is Rochale's daughter, whom we met in 1939 during the visit to the family's village. This diary was collected from the site by Michailo and discovered by the narrator in a Polish archive in 2019. This morning, I woke up very early because I heard a noise outside. Father and Mama are sleeping. Mama is holding David to her breast. It is very stuffy in the hayloft. I'm itching all over from the lice. I looked out through the crack. A big truck came from the village. The Germans were shouting. Then they got into their automobiles and drove away. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stood on a haystack and opened the hatch in the ceiling. The cold air made me gasp. The darkness was lifting. There was not a cloud in the sky. It was very still and quiet. A large butterfly flew up toward me, and I was jealous of it for being so free when I'm locked inside. Now I will go back to sleep and write more later. I'm very hungry, but soon we will be free. And now just the closing two paragraphs of the novel. In February 2020, and this is by the narrator himself, in February 2020, just as the first news of the pandemic was beginning to filter through, I had the last communication from Tali. She was writing from Lviv, where Andriy was spending his sabbatical year. They were living together. For the next few months, I assumed that the pandemic had made it impossible for them to leave. Perhaps I thought they would stay together in Galicia, where we all once came from. Her last words to me were, "I finally come home." That was what her mother had wanted, but I was skeptical. After all those years of wandering, would Tali be able to stay in that land of buried memories and unmarked mass graves? But we lost touch. Then history came back, and Russia invaded Ukraine. Now even the dead could not rest in peace. I was anxious to hear from Tali, but no word came. A friend wrote me from Israel that her son, a paramedic who volunteered to help refugees, had apparently seen Tali in Przemysl, astride the Polish-Ukrainian border, caring for evacuated Ukrainian orphans. Did Andriy go to fight to save Ukraine, to make his grandfather proud? The world had turned around again, and once more, millions of people were losing their homes. Entire cities were in ruins. At least she tried, I thought. So thank you. That's my readings, and I will be very happy to entertain any comments, questions, observations.
I had failed to mention at the outset of your presentation that our listening audience could post questions in the question and answer area. I see none have come in, but I invite all those listening to consider questions for Professor Bartov, maybe Richard too, in the Q&A area. I'll start with one. In your imaginative history, or historical imagination, whichever way you look at this, did you find in the end that you had more questions than answers to what you had set out to do?
That's a really good question. So yes and no, of course. I, I try to answer um, questions. It's not exactly questions. I try to reconstruct the lives of people about whom I knew very little. And in doing that, I discovered lives that had never been recorded, that were completely forgotten, and that was snuffed out, leaving nothing behind. Uh, these lives that I discovered, of course, could have been real lives or were similar to real lives. And in recreating them, it's not just that you're recreating a life, you're actually recreating a story. You are actually discovering what you would not know had you not tried to imagine it. So it would remain completely in the dark. But as you do that, all kinds of other questions come up. So in the story, one of the main questions is what actually happened? And we have different versions of what happened, but we don't know for sure. Who did the killing? We don't know for sure. We have a diary, a confession, but that confession is given by a very old man to his dearly beloved grandson, who thought of him in a completely different way, because the old man had faked his identity throughout his life. And there's no reason to be sure that that confession tells you the real story. He may still have wanted to be loved by his grandfather, by his grandson, even beyond life, and to have told him a story that was not as close to reality as we might think. And so in that sense, we never entirely know. And as you unfold these stories, they all of them leave all kinds of other questions. And my own sense is that this is what we as historians do. As historians, we try to reconstruct some portion, some segment, some fragment of the past, right? But as we do so, we can never be entirely sure that what we have reconstructed is the whole truth or the truth at all. And we are always left with that question because we were not there. We are just basing ourselves on whatever has remained of that event or that era.
Yes, life is complicated and multifaceted. You set your hands on a certain set of facts that you may have researched yourself or in the research of others, but how much is not there? Maybe more than what is.
Yes, yeah, and you know there's an interesting difference when you study history between the modern era, where you have even before the internet and all these electronic endless records, these clouds of information. But even in the 19th century, 20th century, you have masses of information, and the problem is to sift through this information in order to tell a story. If you go back to antiquity or the Middle Ages, you're faced with the opposite conundrum, that you have very little information, and you have to somehow tell a story from a fragment that you find, some inscription, a little document. And in many ways, you have to use your imagination much more in order to reconstruct that world that left so little behind. And then, of course, there are all these other people who had lived during those times, but even in the modern era, about whom nobody wrote anything. They never had a voice. They just passed through the world without leaving any traces. They're never recorded. And it is those in many ways that have interested me, those who don't leave a record, and not the kings and the princes and the generals, but those people who just passed through the shadow of history and vanished again.
Uh-huh. One observation and question that came through in the webinar chat. This is from Richard. Thank you very much for this discussion and reading from your novel. Have you considered the idea that Jorge Luis Borges, not sure, calls the
Borges,
fiction
yeah.
to describe your work?
Let me just have you considered the idea that Borges calls the fictions to describe your work? So yes, look, I mean, this is a serious question. So Borges, of course, was a great fiction writer and was engaged in questions of truth and falsehood, and memory and forgetting, um, records and lack thereof. I believe that he has a story about the map of China that was supposed to have been a perfect map of China. So it was one-on-one. And the problem with it, obviously, was that it was so big that as soon as it was created, it started fraying. And so there is this tension between truth and its representation. How do you actually reflect the reality that you believe you're seeing? For a historian to do what I'm doing in this novel is, of course, almost anathema, because as a historian, I could not have done this. I cannot tell a story if I don't have documentation, if I don't have any record of it. But for me, that thought, and that came to me when I really thought many, many years ago in the 1980s already, that there was this family that I heard a few rumors about, but there's nothing left of it. For me, this, after years of studying this region, made me think that as historians, we tell the truth, but we also don't. That is, we can tell only the documented truth. And by saying that that is what happened in the past, there's a whole lot of that past that we leave untold. And at times, that past may be more important, more revealing of who we are and where we came from than the documented past. And I went through this questioning when I was writing Anatomy of a Genocide as well. Can you use accounts given by people many years later? Are they reliable? Are they as reliable as the documents that you find in an archive? But then again, these documents that you find in the archive were written by people engaged in genocide. Can you believe them, even though they wrote documents and filed them in an archive? And so in a sense, I think for me at least, this showed the fragility of history, and the limitations of my own profession that can, and I think must be overcome by other means. And one means is to try and imagine what cannot be documented.
And further research that might turn up things that one generation had not found. Keep your PhD students occupied.
That is always what historians hope for, that some document will suddenly come up and then you'll be able to retell the story. But it happens less often than we would like.
Another question. Are you writing anything about the current situation in Israel?
Yes, I mean, I've written a fair amount, not fiction, but my own attempts at analysis of what I believe is happening there, of what I think people are seeing, how they are being, how should I put it? How the reality they see is filtered through their own fears, prejudices, the propaganda of their states or their organizations, how all this fits into the larger story of Israel and Palestine, going back decades. how does that fit into what was created after World War II, a regime of international humanitarian law? And finally, I've been trying to think how one can come out of all this. And in the process of that, it's made me think a great deal about the history of the country that I come from, or the history of Zionism, about research projects that I've been doing, working also with Palestinians. So yes, I've been greatly involved in that, and I've managed to also irritate quite a number of people while doing so, which is an interesting experience.
Another observation. One of our listeners says what you've actually made here is midrash in the Jewish tradition.
Well, thank you. That's I'm flattered. It's look, I mean, I want to give you an example because it's part of the novel to sort of give you a sense of how I went about it. I wrote a book that I know Richard read, Tales from the Holocaust, from the Borderlands. And in that book, in the last 3 chapters, there's a sort of long version of a conversation that I had with my mother about her childhood. And in that conversation, I asked her, does she remember members of her family? And she remembers very little because she left Galicia and came to Palestine when she was 11. And I was asking her when she was 71. But she remembers there was one uncle, her mother's brother. And in World War I, they escaped from the Russian army and ended up in Prague. And in Prague, he studied the violin. And because he studied the violin, then she remembered that in family gatherings, he would play the violin. And she remembered these sweet tunes that he played. And that's all she knew about him. But I tried to look him up, and the only thing I could find was that he had married, had 2 children, and they were murdered in another town. And I found their names in a list of people murdered from that town, Kosiv now. And I thought, that's all we know about this man, about Chaim. And so I took that little grain of a story and tried to expand it. Is that midrash? I don't know, but it's taking a little grain of a story and trying to recreate some of this man's life and some of his death. And he dies a difficult death in the novel. And his music, his violin, plays a role in that.
Richard wanted to push the idea of his imaginative historical writing a little bit further and ask, isn't all historical writing imaginative? Consider how much we have learned about the Middle Ages from Eco's Name of the Rose.
Yes, so there are 2 aspects to this. I agree. So I was trained as a historian in Britain in very empirical history, and I am, as a historian, I'm an empirical historian. So that if I read say a biography of Napoleon, and the author sort of gets carried away and puts words in Napoleon's mouth, whatever he has to say about the Russians, which we have no record of, they are possible, but we don't know that he said them. I get a bit annoyed because you can't document that as a historian. Now, if you are someone like Umberto Eco, and you're an extremely well-read individual, you literally live in your library, and you create a fictional world, which is one that is reflects much of what we know about that world. And in doing that, you bring it to life. Then you're not engaging in fraud, you're engaging in a literary undertaking that brings you closer to the truth. Now, you can think of historians who tried to do that. Huizenga, from the beginning of the 20th century, wrote The Waning of the Middle Ages, a wonderful book that had a huge influence on historians, where he tried to imagine the world of the late Middle Ages through documents, but obviously used his imagination. And Marc Bloch, who was a French-Jewish medievalist, a great medievalist, wrote on feudal society, using the documentation and knowledge that he could find, but in a beautiful, imaginative manner. And I remember reading him as an undergraduate and admiring that skill. So there is a sort of relationship between the two, and they can overlap. But it's, to me at least, it's always important. We know that The Name of the Rose is a work of fiction. And we know that Marc Bloch's Feudal Society or Huizinga's The Waning of the Middle Ages are historical works. And if we read them together, we learn a great deal from one and from the other.
Any other comments or questions that we can entertain before we close? No, it doesn't look like it. Well, the one question about your thoughts on Israel today lead me to remind everyone before closing about next week's events. These are coming very close together, today's and next week's symposium. Just worked out that way. But next week, we have two gentlemen returning to campus who haven't been here for a number of years, a pandemic in between, David Makovsky and Raith Alomari, extending what they had done back then in the Israel-Palestinian dialogues. They will be talking about the current situation, what the outcomes possibly could be, the origins of the situation, etc. This is on next Sunday, March the 10th, at 7 p.m. in the evening, and the venue of Congregation B'nai B'rith on Macumba Road. This is in a flyer which has already been distributed, and I will distribute again. Then on the next day, Monday, the 11th of March, at 3 p.m. at the Hillel Community Building in Isla Vista, a second presentation. The first one was David Makovsky alone, and the second one at the Hillel Building in Isla Vista is both David Makovsky and Raith Alomari. They'll be talking about the current situation. So there'll be a lot to be said then, and probably many questions. I will distribute the flyer again about it. It gives all the information, the addresses, etc. These are live events. They will be recorded, but not live streamed as far as I know. At least that's not the plan right now. So breaking from what we've been doing these past few years, all events being virtual, these events are going to be on campus in here in Santa Barbara. So I want to thank Professor Bartov for a fascinating introduction to the family that he imagines and their lives, and the lives of those people living in that region at the time. It's very eventful and told in a most engaging way. Very much appreciated. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today.
Thank you so much, and thank you all.
So until next week already, on Sunday, 7 o'clock in the evening, about which further information soon to come. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.